Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the executive webinar series from Columbia Business School Executive Education. Today's seminar topic is Lead as Coach, Taming the Seven Crocodiles. And before we begin here, I'll just briefly go through a few housekeeping rules. So during the webinar, not to worry, a recording will be available after the webinar, so if you miss any part of it or have to step out, we will have a full recording for you to review after the webinar. And after the content portion of today's webinar, we'll have a Q&A session where we'll answer a few questions. And please use the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of the Zoom screen on your window there. And also during the webinar, after the webinar, we encourage you to tweet about the topic and everything you've learned here today using the hashtag at CBSExecEd. So moving along, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have joining us from Seattle today is Hylke Faber, who is a facilitator and coach for Constancy, as well as the director of Leader as Coach, where he participates in person and online, helping to coach through the Leaders Coach program here at CBS Executive Education. And joining us today in our studios here in New York is Professor Joel Brockner, the Philip Heddleman Professor of Business at Columbia Business School. So thank you so much, professors, for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Nate, and welcome everyone to this conversation about leading as coach. So as we get into it, let's first start with the question, which is why care about coaching? Why even think about a topic as leading as coach? So to go into that question, let's think together about people that we admire. So think for a moment about people you admire, and people that come immediately to my mind are like Abe Lincoln, FDR, and Anne Frank. And when I think, for example, about Anne Frank, I'm admiring her courage and creativity in the midst of being locked up for several years in a small space, facing death at any moment, and yet being creative. So when I think about a person like Anne Frank or a person like FDR or Abe Lincoln, I start thinking about what's possible, and that inspires me. So often when we think about people that we admire, we may touch into something that has to do with what is possible. And you could say coaching is about helping us, ourselves and others, to become aware of what's possible and start acting on it. Now, that may sound a little bit esoteric, so let's see if we can make it more concrete, because we can do research about this as well. And Gallup did lots of research on this topic of what motivates and retains people's most talented employees. And they came up with 12 factors, and 6 out of these factors are about learning and development, or about growth, or about coaching, doing my best work, recognition, somebody cares about me, development, progress, learning and growing. So learning and growing motivates. It brings out the best in us. Like in nature, we like to grow. There's something in us that likes to grow, that likes to connect and keep connecting more and more on this endless journey of what's possible. And when I think about myself, it's true for me as well. I didn't grow up in Seattle, Washington. I grew up on a farm in the north of the Netherlands, and this is me on the right here at, I think, age 4 or 5. And I just remember the fascination with the cows and the smells and the churches and the fields, and then starting to expand the world from that beyond the little village to the city, to the world, and being in New York City and seeing the world, and always being sort of excited by this ongoing revelation of what this world's about. And I almost became a monk at some point, becoming curious about what's possible when you get really interested in what happens within a person. So coaching or learning about ourselves motivates. It creates a sense of energy that actually we can always access. And that's not where it stops, because coaching is not only about motivation, it's also about innovation. Think about this. 88% of the companies in the 1955 Fortune 500 list are not on that list in 2014. And we all know this. The world changes very, very fast around us. And to make sure that we stay a relevant contribution, we need to innovate ourselves. So coaching innovates. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, says, always keep the learning bit on. That's very crucial about me. So coaching innovates. And it doesn't stop there. Because think about great coaching conversations you've had, either formally or informally, chances are that you still have some kind of relationship with the person that you coached or that you were coached by. So when we start sharing about what's going on within us, when we start sharing about our aspirations and maybe about our fears, it develops connection. So coaching actually creates relationship. So coaching creates relationship, it innovates, and it creates meaning. So there's something to it. So there may be more to it than the eye might tell us at first. So leading as coach is important. You could say is kind of important in our work. So then the question is, what is it really? So to make that a little bit clear, let's think about a word that coaching comes from. Coaching comes from the Hungarian word koci, which means coach, like a transportation vehicle that brings you from point A to point B. So coaching, you could say, is about helping people to move from current state to a desired state. So then the next question we might ask ourselves in leading as coach, when we think about leading as coach, who do we coach? Like, where is our highest area of leverage? Where do we have the highest impact? Is it with coaching ourselves, coaching others, or coaching a system? So I ask you to think about this for a moment. Let's think about it together. Where do we have the highest leverage? Is it in coaching ourselves, coaching others, or coaching a system? Thousands of years ago, when people were looking for coaching, not from leading as coach, but informally in ancient Greece, they would travel sometimes for days to get an answer to a question they were facing. And they would travel and face all kinds of obstacles, and finally they would arrive at this place called Delhi. And they would hope to speak to the oracle, and the oracle would speak to them. And yet, the experience that's being described of where people had their greatest revelation were not so much coming from the oracle itself, but actually from what the atmosphere was in the Oracle of Delhi. And the atmosphere, you could say, was described by a little statement that was inscribed over the gate. And it said, "Know thyself." So people found the answers by actually looking more deeply into themselves. When we think about where our greatest leverage is in leading as coach, the person that's always going to be here, the only thing that we can count on, guaranteed, that will change tomorrow, is not the other or the system. It is ourselves. So coaching ourselves, you might say, has the greatest leverage. So then let's have an experience of how do we coach ourselves? How do we really coach ourselves? By doing a little experiment. So let's put ourselves right now in the chair of the coachee. Let's think about each of us having a challenge or something we'd like to be coached on. And me this morning, I'm thinking about a new partnership I'm setting up with an online company that will help me to create 5-minute a day learning experiences with coachees. So in this challenge, what I would like to have happen is a very smooth collaboration. And I see some obstacles in that. So think about a challenge you're facing. And let's do a poll about this. Which of those 7 areas would you like to see happen progress on? Let's take a look at the poll right now. Let's field this poll. Is it about gaining more financial security? Is it about building stronger relationships? Is it about doing a better job? Or maybe about learning something new? Is it about making more of an impact? Is it about resolving an inner conflict or an outer conflict to build a more cohesive organization? Or is it about fostering more ease, compassion, wisdom, and excellence? See which of those 7 areas is most like your challenge. Of course, your words were probably going to be different from the words on this poll, but just see which of those 7 areas is most like your challenge. So for me, it's actually about number 2, building a stronger relationship with others, building a stronger sense of collaboration. So that's the radio button I would click. So take a moment and please click your answers now. Very good. So let's take a look at the poll results and see together this morning and this afternoon or this evening, wherever we are in the world, what would we like to be coached on? So you see that there's no right answer to this question. Yeah, that we have answers all over the page, and this is the same with, you could say, the coachees that come into our office, whether it's us being with ourselves or a colleague coming into our office. So, and we see that today making more of an impact is probably the one that has most votes. And then to look at this, one can become curious about, well, why do we give those 7 kind of answers? Well, these 7 answers are related to 7 values, you could say. We all know about Maslow's hierarchy of need. Richard Barrett did a lot of research in organizations about what people want to grow into and what motivates them. And he came up with 7 values. And we can actually look at people's coaching questions, our own and those of others, from those 7 perspectives: survival, making ends meet; relationship, belonging; self-esteem, being someone; learning, realizing my potential; making a difference, contributing of myself; cohesion, understanding, integrating polarized parts; and wisdom and compassion, and finding meaning. Now, why is it important to be able to categorize where our coaching motivation is? Well, because it gives us also some clues about why we might not yet realize that, because with each motivation comes also the obstacle. Because why do we have not yet, in my case, all this collaboration? Well, of course, I can take a look at the other, but as we are saying, following the example of the Oracle of Delhi, the greatest leverage is within myself. So let's take a look within ourselves. Why we might not have had a full fulfillment of one of those 7 levels of aspiration? Well, the answer lies partially in how our nervous system works. And to keep it super simple today, there's a part of our nervous system which many of us know called the amygdala, which is almost like a symbol for our fight, flight, fear, survival mechanism in our nervous system. And from that perspective, change, whether it's even if it's a motivation towards something quote unquote good, is bad. So we all know this. Let's do a quick experiment. Cross your arms for a moment. Let's do it together. And now let's cross them the other way. And relax again. So the second time is uncomfortable, isn't it? Our nervous system is primarily geared towards survival and not towards change. So there's something in our nervous system that wants to keep things the same. And the amygdala will make everything in its power possible to make sure that we keep things the same. And it has, you could say, versus these 7 motivations, 7 crocodilian strategies that it has devised over many, many generations in evolution to keep us safe. And those 7 strategies you could call the 7 fear families. In terms of our motivation for survival, we could be driven to not survive and not fall into the trap of not surviving by becoming worried about poverty. In terms of building strong relationship, we're going to hold back because we might be driven by the fear of abandonment. In terms of having an interest in self-esteem, we might get so focused on that we're worried about failing. In terms of wanting to learn something, we're going to have to face the fear of uncertainty. In terms of making a difference, we'll have to face the fear of hurt. In terms of trying to create cohesion, we have to face the fear of overwhelm. And in terms of wisdom and compassion, we have to face the fear of losing identity. So in coaching ourselves, we are continuously faced with a choice. Do we give in to our amygdalan responses or reactions, we called the reactive crocodiles, or do we start making space, like Anne Frank and others, for something that's bigger than our amygdala, bigger than our 7 fear families? The leaders we admire really understood this. And let's learn from one particular leader that we all know, called FDR. What you see here on the page is the first part of a radio address, which I will share with you in a little bit. FDR came to the presidency in 1933, while you could say the US was in the grip of the Great Crocodile, the Great Depression. People were standing in line to get bread. People were standing in line to withdraw money from the banks. And when John Maynard Keynes, the economist, was asked if he had seen anything like this before, he said, yes. It was called the Dark Ages, and it lasted 400 years. The previous president, Herbert Hoover, had left office basically saying there's nothing Washington can do anymore. FDR, in March of 1933, when he became president and took office, acted decisively. He took, his first thing was he made an acceptance speech, inauguration speech, where he talked about the power of fear, as we all know. Then he did something very radical. He closed the banks, and he closed them for an entire week because the banks were collapsing and were about to collapse. And then after that first week of his presidency, imagine living in a country with a new president where the banks have been closed and the country has been in a Great Depression for years now. What will you think? Monday morning comes and you know the banks are going to open again. There was a great deal of anxiety, understandably. And here's what FDR did. He went on the radio and delivered a 14.5-minute fireside chat to which many, many Americans listened. And I want to just share with you a small excerpt from this radio address to see what we can learn from FDR about coaching ourselves from our crocodile to our owl, from our fear to what is possible. My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking, to talk with a comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more importantly, with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. This bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. And then he said, after all, there's an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people themselves. Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore the financial system, and it's up to you to support it and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem, no less than it is mine. Let us unite in banishing fear. Together, we cannot fail. FDR coached the nation to go from fear to courage. The next morning, that Monday in March, people were lining up for the banks again. And this time, it was not to withdraw money, but actually to bring the money back. And by the end of March of 1933, 2/3 of the withdrawn hoarded cash had been redeposited in the system. And many people see that as the restoration of the system of capitalism as we know it today. So one person, by stepping from a place of fear to a place of courage, was able to coach a nation from a place of crocodilian contraction to a place of possibility. So let's now hear how we can actually coach people going from one to many, learning more about how can we help to mitigate the crocodile and moving more into an owl culture.
So this Joel Brockner here, transitioning away from Hylke for a few moments. And it occurred to me when I joined forces with Hylke that, that we can learn a lot about coaching a system from theory and research and actual practice around organizational change. Change on a large scale, like the ones that I've indicated on the screen, but even small scale changes we can learn a lot from trying to implement small-scale changes, and we can even learn a lot from thinking about coaching as an art of bringing about change among key individuals. So whether you're trying to change a system, a group, a few people, or even one person, there's ways to think about how we bring that about. And this is what my colleagues and I have been studying and researching at Columbia and elsewhere these last few years. So very briefly, can you move the slide forward? Yeah. What I've been trying to understand is, what are the factors that cause people in responding to change and more broadly to decisions and events in the workplace? What are the factors that cause them to say, great, I'm excited, we should have done this a long time ago, versus having the opposite response of responding with resistance and skepticism, some of the crocodiles that Hylke alluded to. And what we're finding is that two broad categories seem to make a difference. One, people ask the question, as a result of moving in this new direction, am I going to be better off or worse off? So people care about the outcomes. For example, in a change situation, if your organization is giving you new responsibility, is it better responsibility or is it worse responsibility? If it's a relocation, for example, did your commute to work just get longer or shorter? Have your career prospects changed for the better, or for the worse? And people quickly size up what the change will mean for them. And no surprise, they're more likely to embrace rather than resist the change if they think the outcomes are going to make them better off rather than worse off. Now, that seems kind of obvious. You didn't have to go to Columbia Business School to learn that principle, but it does have important implications for people who are trying to bring about change. And that is, as a coach, part of your challenge is to convince people what's in it for them, how people are going to be better off, how the system's going to be better off, or at the very least not worse off as a result of the change. So outcomes matter. Over and above outcomes, what we're finding is that it's not, again, not simply the outcome, but also the process, the quality of the procedures that were used to try to bring about the change. Was it handled well? And by handling it well, one way to actually one way to think about the research findings that we've been involved with, I've summarized them in this 2x3 matrix. So let me quickly walk you through it. It basically says what I just told you, that people react better if the favorability of the outcome is high rather than low, if the quality of the process is high rather than low. So what you have in front of you are how people react to various changes, events, and decisions in the workplace as a function of whether they think they're going to be better off or worse off. And so, again, the higher the score, the more positively people are responding, to the change. But there are some interesting wrinkles in the numbers that I wanted to call to your attention. One is, we've all heard the expression, all's well that ends well. It's when outcomes are favorable, that's when people don't really care as much about the quality of the process, how well it was handled. It's when where the process seems to matter more is when people feel like they're on the receiving end of unfavorable outcomes. When you have to make the so-called tough decisions, that's when it matters much more whether you handle the process well rather than less well. Or another way to think about these numbers is that if you handle the process well, people's reactions don't depend as much on the the favorability of the outcome. So you have essentially two levers: try to convince people that they're going to be better off rather than worse off; convince people that the process was handled well rather than less well. I would argue that you probably have more leverage over the process than you do over the outcome. You can't give all people favorable outcomes, but what you can and should do when you're trying to bring about change is try to ensure that you handle the process in a high quality way. So let me just take a few moments to talk about what do we mean by handling the process in a high quality way. What does it mean to handle the process well? And as you can see on the screen, there's really 4 sets of action steps that agents of change need to action steps that they need to take in order to bring about change. First, to surface dissatisfaction with the current state. People need to feel like the current situation just isn't working. It's not satisfactory to them. But you can't only talk about what's wrong. You have to show people, if you're trying to bring about change, you have to show people a better alternative. And that better alternative is captured by the V word for vision. Now, even that's not enough. If you talk about what's wrong, if you show people a better alternative, they don't just simply morph from the dissatisfying current state to the better future state. You have to have a process in place to help people make the journey. And even that's not enough. And this is what Hylke was talking about earlier, these bases of resistance, the 7 crocodiles. You have to have a plan in place to reduce the costs of change, or another way of putting that is lower people's resistance to change. Make those crocodiles, in other words, a little bit less prominent, so that people feel like they have the reason to want to move in the new direction. So we sum this up with a high quality process consisting of surfacing satisfaction, having a vision for the future, having a process outweighing the costs of change, or outweighing people's bases of resistance to change. Again, the crocodiles to which Hylke alluded. And if you can do all those things, then change is likely to be brought about. And that's true regardless of whether it's large-scale systemic change, smaller changes that you're trying to introduce in your organization, or even change at an individual level. If you don't pay attention to enacting all 4 of these action steps, then change is unlikely to be brought about. My final comment with regard to what I call the high quality process, this DVPC, all the elements of a high quality process, it's easier said than done. Easier to talk about doing these things than to actually do them. Among the things that we're interested in is identifying what some of the barriers are. Again, what are the resistance points? And then ways of dealing with the barriers. Because once we know what the barriers are, we can start to think about ways to deal with them, deal with those crocodiles that can so often get in the way. And when we do all those things, we're likely to bring about lasting change in the system, lasting change in groups, lasting change in people.
So to sum this up, we've covered very briefly 3 areas for coaching: coaching self, coaching others, and coaching the system, with a focus on coaching self and coaching the system, and thinking about how to transform 7 crocodiles, or the costs of change, and creating more momentum for D, V, and P, which are pillars of the owl. So let's have a few moments now for questions. Nate.
All right, thank you so much to both of you for that session. A reminder to participants to please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window to submit any questions. We have one here from Jorge Trevino. He says, change in culture. Everyone says that you cannot have one without the other. How are they connected, and what comes first?
So very quickly on that. So change in culture, to me, they are almost simultaneous. So, and it's like it's a loop. So often the change is defined in a business outcome. Where do I want to go? What do I want to achieve? That's different from what it was before: new organization, new business result, new market. And then simultaneously, in the same breath, in the same meeting, we have to start asking, and therefore, what are the new mindsets and behaviors that are needed, culture that is needed to make that possible? And let's define the costs of change, and let's define the crocodiles that are going to have to be tamed, you could say. And therefore, what are the actions we can take on the individual level, on the coaching other level, and the coaching system level? What do you think, Joel?
Yeah, and I think that's very well put. I think it ultimately comes down to, as you said, Hylke, finding out why we're not doing those things in the first place. What are the barriers? What are the things that get in the way? So if you're trying to bring about cultural change, for example, then we need to understand those barriers. Once we understand the barriers, then we're in a much better position to do something about it.
Yes, I agree.
All right, and we have another question here. What are some of the common barriers you find in organizational change, and what are some things that can be done to move them?
Well, I think that's what that's essentially the kind of the crocodiles are right in there, the various reasons. But essentially, it comes down to I think 2 broad categories. Sometimes people don't want to move in the new direction. They think they're going to be giving up something. They're going to be worse off. They're going to lose their job security. They're going to lose their basis of power, and so forth. So sometimes it's just pure motivation that gets in the way, and it's going to be lost, and that's what's salient to people. Other times, the basis of resistance is not so much that people don't want to go there, it's that they don't think they can go there. They don't think they have the skill set. You're taking them out of their comfort zone. So I might very much want to move in a new direction, but if I don't think I can enact the behaviors that will help me move there, then I'm going to be resistant for that reason as well. So it's often said that motivation or behavior is a function of what we want to do as well as what we are capable of doing. And in like fashion, the bases of resistance fall into those two categories as well.
And just to add to that, and to make that very simple, because change often is very complex. To make it very simple, with culture change, it's drilling it down to the very few crocodiles on the individual and the system level that keep the change from happening. So to make that very simple, if you look at the 7 fear families, one can often identify 1 or 2 that are at the core of it. So in some organizations, it's the fear of exclusion or changing the tribe. In other ones, it's we may not make our numbers. Or think about like Adobe going from licensed software to packaged software to the cloud. People being very concerned about the survival of the company. In other companies, it might be being very concerned about the fear of uncertainty. And so being able to name those as collective fears, and as leaders to name them as the fears that I have myself, and then how to work with those, can be tremendously transformational. And I've seen that many times in organizations when leaders do that.
All right, and we have time for one more question here. This one is, when is a good time to coach?
So from this perspective of leading as coach, the coaching is always, because we always coach ourselves. And the question that I ask myself every morning is, how can I give myself my best self today? And what crocodiles might I want to tame today? Because it's like a continuous sculpting project, continuous taming project, you could say, of taming crocodiles, fears, beliefs that I've learned that get in my way, so that I can show up more and more and more of who I really am and serve others that way. So to me, it's a continuous process. Now, coaching others is a more tricky question, which is, people are not always willing to be coached. So the very important question when coaching somebody is always first, do you want to be coached by me? And be completely open to them saying no.
Right. So I think, yeah, and I think those are great points. I'd add to it, related to Hylke's last point. A great time to coach is when people are in a state of uncertainty, either when change is being introduced in the organization or when they are new to the organization. Because when there's uncertainty, people are looking for guidance, looking for direction, looking for coaching. And so the coach is likely to get a bigger bang for his or her buck if they're dealing with somebody who's in a state of uncertainty than they might be, than they would if the person were feeling more certain, more confident, more comfortable with doing things the way that they know how. So that's a good time. I agree with Hylke that in general, it's a good thing to do, but especially when people are open to it, and they're likely to be open around times of uncertainty.
Excellent. The last point I'd like to sort of say by way of closing before we close the webinar, what I've noticed in change, in times of change in organizational cultures and greatness, is that when there's an area, an atmosphere of fascination, where every moment is seen as an opportunity for learning, for coaching. And I think Satya Nadella of Microsoft is role modeling this really well, where he says, always keep the learning bit switched on, or like FDR, like what becomes possible when you confront things with courage, which is another way of saying, like, how can you be a little bit more courageous today? So if we can infuse that, then every moment, whether it's change or even status quo, becomes an opportunity for growth and therefore greater engagement. So I hope it's helpful.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Hylke, and thank you to both of our speakers today. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us for today's webinar. We just want to make a final note that the webinar recording will be available, and please check back with us as we'll continue to have more series of webinars like this one. And thanks so much to everyone. See you next time.